Is It in Pevsner? A short history of the building of series. Charles.
The hall was originally part of the London mansion of John Mackworth, Dean of Lincoln, who died in 1541. He left the property to the Dean and Chapter, and they leased it to Lionel Barnard, who in his turn allowed students of law to use it. The hall dates from the late 14th century. Its one remarkable and indeed very rare feature is the original octagonal lantern or louver. Part of the roof with arched braces and hollow chamfered tie beams and collar beams is also original. The walls are faced with yellow brick and have altered windows, which are just one almost unbroken row of square-headed lights. Early 16th century linen fold panelling with some Renaissance motifs. The buildings to the east and northwest are of yellow brick and seem to be early 19th century. That style of succinct description and the relentless focus on the architectural features will be familiar to many people. And indeed, the image on screen will also show you a familiar page and layout from the Pevsner guides. The words are indeed those of Nikolaus Pevsner. In his entry for Fetter Lane, in the volume titled London, the Cities of London and Westminster, published in 1957, and describing the building in which I'm speaking to you. And I'm happy to report that looking around me, his description appears to be broadly correct. Now, that book was just one of a sequence that would eventually number 46 volumes, covering the whole of England, county by county, and which is the subject of this evening's lecture. The first salvo came in 1951, when Penguin Books published 3 slim paperback guides to Cornwall, Middlesex, and Nottinghamshire. 23 years later, the book for Staffordshire brought that cycle of works to a close, and the question, is it in Pevsner, was early to the lips of anyone interested in the buildings of England. Revision and updating of the earliest works began even in Pevsner's lifetime. This year, that programme has been brought full circle once again, with completion of full revisions of every book in the English series, and concluding, as it happens, with Staffordshire once more. But now the series stretches to 56 volumes and is certainly no longer limited to England, but extended to Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Few, least of all Pevsner himself, can have imagined that at the conception of the English series that it would be completed not once, but twice, and would stand out in the world as a unique and unrivaled companion to understanding and appreciation of British and Irish architecture, both ancient and modern. Now, the evening's lecture is essentially about the series, but of course it's impossible to avoid beginning with the remarkable man. Nikolaus Pevsner was born in Leipzig in 1902. He belongs, therefore, to that early 20th century generation whose lives, their childhood and adulthood, were cleaved by the First World War and the experiences of living in a country reconstructing itself after the conflict. In 1929, he was in possession of his first full teaching post at Göttingen University, and this had actually occasioned his first visit to England in 1930 to source material for lectures on British art and architecture for an English studies course. The German universities each ran courses of studies of other cultures, and Göttingen in Hanover, with its historic English connections, meant that that was why Pevsner had been asked to produce that. But when he arrived here, he was very struck by what he perceived as the backwardness of much modern English architecture in comparison with the continent, and it might be said also the inadequacy of, for example, the Baedeker guides, which pretended to offer worthy descriptions of buildings of the country. And records of his trip attest to his omnivorous interest in gathering information, allied to an astonishing work ethic. Now, it presented England as a plausible option when, with the rise of Hitler, Pevsner's Russian Jewish ancestry ensured his removal from his post and led eventually to his decision to leave the country altogether. So it was that he first returned to England in 1934, initially on a temporary basis, or so he imagined, lodging in Birmingham, and using the initial months here to collect research material for what would become his study, Pioneers of the Modern Movement, published by Faber and Faber in 1936. And alongside this, he was granted a fellowship at Birmingham University to undertake an inquiry into industrial art and design, commissioned by Philip Florence, the professor of commerce there, to analyse the role of the designer in industry, and the findings of which were initially issued as a series of articles and then published as a volume in 1937. Between them, these projects would keep Pevsner busy, if not well remunerated. But then the passage of the Nuremberg race laws made it clear that the prospect of returning home was closed to him. And in 1936, he brought his family to London, having secured a home at number 2 Wildwood Terrace in Hampstead, not perhaps in the most fashionable part of Hampstead, but where he remained in a rather plain Victorian brick house for the rest of his life, and where in time the English Heritage Blue plaque was erected to his memory in 2007. And indeed, his children continued to live in the same row until very, very recently. What facilitated this opportunity to be reunited with his family and more secure financially was a job working as a buyer for the London shop of the furniture designer Gordon Russell of Broadway in Worcestershire, a maker that Pevsner had taken time to praise for his work in his inquiry into industrial art. And indeed, Russell's firm would produce the desk that Pevsner and his successors have taken from office to office over the course of the history of the series. This is the image on screen is the now relatively elderly Pevsner with Russell in about 1967, and this photo is actually on display in the Russell Museum in Broadway today. And it was in this period also that Pevsner even tried his own hand at interior decoration, working up a scheme, not realised, for a Griblock house in Stirlingshire, in Scotland, a house of 1938 to 9, done in a kind of quasi-modern style by the young Basil Spence. But as I say, it wasn't realised, and so we will never know what other life Pevsner might have had had things proved more favourable. His object, obviously, was the prize of a full academic post, teaching art history, as he had done in Germany, but that, during the 30s at least, remained remote. And as the decade progressed towards its by now well-known denouement, Pevsner continued to have to live a diverse life of employment. The critical moment came through his connections with the Architectural Review magazine, to which he'd been committing articles in the mid-30s, and which at that time was the most progressive and wide-ranging of the journals. That brought him into contact with its assistant editor, Jim Richards, whose introduction to modern architecture had been published by Penguin Books in their Pelican series of non-fiction titles in 1937, with its distinctive blue livery. At some point on the eve of the Second World War, Richard made an introduction for Pevsner to Alan Lane, the suave and dynamic director of Penguin, who was looking for an author for a single-volume history on European architecture. So that became another title in the Pelican series, an outline of European architecture, which Pevsner partly prepared in rather unusual circumstances while interned as an enemy alien in mid-1940 after the fall of France. But the fact that he turned that time to positive work was very typical of, as we will see, his incredible appetite for being busy. And he and others were sent to the half-built housing estate at Huyton on the edge of Liverpool, which would become Harold Wilson's constituency. He was lucky, unlike others, in being able to obtain his release back to London reasonably quickly, and so returned to London in 1941, and in fact began fire watching during night raids at Birkbeck College, which had stayed open through the war and where he was also engaged as a part-time lecturer. At that time, the college was in Bream's Buildings, very close to where I'm speaking to you now, between Chancery Lane and Fetter Lane. It was a 19th century building that was ultimately hit by a bomb in 1944, but he retained a description of it, and if I remember rightly, its sort of fat features in his book for London, despite its loss. But I think the interesting thing is that obviously that Blitz experience was simultaneously destroying, obviously, swathes of London. And I show you an image from the college history of the extent of damage in the immediate environs around this part of the edge of the city. But of course, it had also sharpened public interest in the possibilities of replanning once the war was concluded, and which was promoted through a variety of exhibitions and publications on the subject. For example, the Living in Cities by Ralph Tubbs, published in 1942, and which the image shows the past in the form of the great medieval churches, the yesterday, the polluted industrial areas, today, the blitzed out cities, and tomorrow, the planner, architect setting forth with set, square, and compasses to remake England. It was also in this period that Pevsner took over as assistant editor at the Architectural Review, and in 1942 contributed a series of articles called Treasure Hunts, all published in a single issue in that year. And this was, as Anne Hulch, who's written about this series, has described it as architectural history from eye level, and invited the reader to date your district by observation of small details, elevations above shop fronts and so forth, and relate them to broader architectural history, showing that at this early date, Pevsner's interest in communicating to an interested but lay audience and stressing the importance of visual appreciation. And that approach chimed very well with similar initiatives in the years after the war, such as the Picture Penguins that laid similar emphasis. For example, the Things We See series with a volume on houses by the architect Lionel Brett, published in 1947. And I think in those treasure hunts, one can see the beginnings of what would make Pevsner a household name. The route to that in 1945 was that now well established as Alan Lane's captive expert on architecture, Pevsner was invited to his house at Stanwell in Middlesex in the west of London to offer suggestions for a new series of books. And the house is shown here on the left. This is my photograph taken when I was completing the revision of the Surrey volume a couple of years ago, and was this bit of Middlesex is a little sliver that was taken into Surrey in the mid-1960s. And I was amazed to find, hidden behind much new development, here was the house where it had all begun, and in the garden in which Lane and Pevsner had discussed plans for after the war. Unfortunately, what looks like quite a nice setting is completely spoiled by the fact that it's at the end of the runway at Heathrow. And if I'd taken that photo a couple of moments later, there would be an enormous jumbo flying straight over the roof. However, Pevsner had two proposals. One was for the multi-volume scholarly history of art and architecture, which became the Pelican History of Art. The other was for a series of guidebooks to English architecture, inspired by the De Hio Handbook series, which had been available to German travellers since about 1900. This idea of having an equivalent English series was an idea which Pevsner had tried out without success on other publishers before the war. But the post-war moment was propitious in that it fitted in with the revival of curiosity about the country after the conflict, and obviously the renewed accessibility to England for inquiring travellers once things like petrol coupons were abolished. The mission would be defined really as covering all ecclesiastical, public and domestic buildings of interest, a suitably elastic criteria which has proved extraordinarily helpful ever since. Work began in 1947. Penguin provided Pevsner with his office and a secretary. The offices were in a succession of buildings, initially in Bloomsbury, more than one address in Gower Street, a thoroughfare famously written off by Ruskin, and close to Bedford Square, which Pevsner would regard as the greatest of the 18th century squares in London. But it was, of course, a very convenient location for him because it was both close to the reading room of the library, then in the British Museum, and in time also for Birkbeck College, which had relocated to Mallet Street by the University of London campus in 1952, and where Pevsner continued to teach. In those early days, Pevsner employed 2 German secretaries to prepare his research notes, probably fellow refugees deprived of their academic careers, and subsequently a succession of students to do the rather laborious work of extracting material for Pevsner to then take on his travels, and including, of course, John Harris, who later became a co-author in the series, who writes very pungently but amusingly about his distaste for the work. Now, mostly at that time, the information that was being drawn was, of course, secondary. There was really no time or priority to be given to primary research for these books. So most of it was coming from existing published surveys of buildings. That meant the scholarly inventories produced by the Royal Commission on Historical Monuments for each county, never completed. The detailed parish histories of the Victoria History of the Counties of England, the famous Red Book series, and in the capital there was, of course, the Survey of London volumes, founded by, amongst others, the architect and designer C.R. Ashby in the last years of the 19th century. Indeed, all of these big surveys had been begun around the years around 1900. None were complete by Pevsner's day. None are still complete by our own day. And as I say, the commission inventories were given up years ago. But then nor were they comprehensive in their coverage with cut-off dates for buildings in the commission inventories, and they certainly weren't portable. There were, of course, portable and popular tourist guides, such as the Shell Guides, which began in 1934, or even older antiquarian county histories to draw on, but with very varied coverage of architecture, or items like the Murray's handbooks, which these were also reissued without success after the war. But they, without being unfair to them, were inclined to concentrate on the antiquarian or the picturesque, with a lot more emphasis on biographical or anecdotal details than was something that the Pevsner guides were going to include. So that was not something, not a model that Pevsner was aiming to emulate in the first guide to be published, which was to Cornwall. It is said because he gave his secretaries the option of which book they'd like to research first, so they opted for an attractive holiday county. So Cornwall was technically the first, coming out in the same year, 51, with Middlesex and Nottinghamshire. And what was very clear from the beginning was the strong identity, brand, if you like, that the books had fitting in with the generally strong design identity that Penguin committed to all of its publications. They started, of course, as small, very portable, quite thin paperbacks, only went into hardback later from the mid-60s. And the thing that set them out early on was the contribution of one of the designers, Bertold Wolper, who produced these little roundels that featured a sort of vignette or detail from one of the buildings of the county on the jacket. These were given up later once the books went into hardback, but they usually were a detail, just occasionally full buildings. And in a way, Pevsner very much set out his stall with the second volume for London by including as its roundel the by then extremely new Royal Festival Hall. And you can see how they were then used in other, Penguin promotional material there for the Cornish volume. Now, Pevsner's outline, published in 1942, the articles he'd written for the Architectural Review, and his general lectures at Cambridge, where he was now Slade Professor, and also at Birkbeck in London, had shown that he was in no way a narrow specialist, and undoubtedly the success of the Buildings of series as it evolved owed a lot to his interest in a broad spectrum of buildings. Unlike those established older surveys with their arbitrary cut-off dates, Pevsner's aim was to cover all periods of architecture up to the present day and explain their interest to his readers in books of a portable size. So, for example, in Middlesex, the very thin paperback of 51, he was in a position to grapple both with the sort of high and low of modern underground stations, which were, in a way, the most modern buildings in Middlesex by that time, the pre-war designs by Charles Holden, as well as major items like Lord Burlington's villa at Chiswick. While a county, a more traditional county like Nottinghamshire, provided the opportunity to engage deeply with medieval buildings, which was where, in many ways, Pevsner had begun, and indeed which allowed him to return to a subject in Southwell Minster, examining the naturalistic leaf carving in the chapter house there, and on which he produced a special King Penguin book in the early 40s. The early 40s I keep mentioning, and that's just an indication of its incredible output that, within a couple of years, and this was characteristic really of Pevsner from then on, was this constant output of which the Buildings of was really only one part. So how was it done? I mentioned the extraction of material from volumes like the Royal Commission. They were put into fat folders of notes for Pevsner to set off to visit 2 counties a year in the Easter and summer university vacations, ostensibly to result in 2 publications a year by Penguin. Here he is on site in Dorset in the early 1960s, I'd have thought. And the dress, the Mac, and the equipment are very characteristic of his methodology. Holding that board on which he secured small pieces of paper, either A5 or quartered sheets of A4, held down with a rubber band to make his notes. And as you see here on the right of the screen, occasional sketches. This is actually material compiled on a site visit to Chichester Cathedral in preparation for the Sussex volume, with small details of tracery designs. You will also probably pick up from that, regardless of the quality of the image, the illegibility of much of his handwriting. And all these notes are preserved. They are all stored in the Historic England archive and available for anyone to consult. And earlier in my time with the series, I was responsible for handling inquiries, and I felt I had to always warn people. The information may be in the box, whether you can actually read what it says is another matter. So this dedication to two counties a year, 2 books a year, would be impressive enough in itself had this been Pevsner's only activity. But the pre-war and wartime investments in seeking work are now paying off, possibly too handsomely. As I say, in the form of the Slade Professorship at Cambridge from 1949, the ongoing work for Birkbeck, as well as a wider celebrity through a growing profile on radio, culminating in the Reith Lectures of 1955 on the Englishness of English art, a theme going right back to that first foray to England in 1930, and his interest in what set this country's architecture apart from, while within, the European scene. And all this had to be accommodated to the annual tours, and the balance became acute in serving the series with the turn to the 1960s, by which time the growing reputation of the series was recommending him as a figure suitable to serve on professional bodies and entering a period of what he called non-stopology. Initially, the journeys were undertaken, driven by Lola, Pevsner's wife, until her unexpected death in 1963, seen here enjoying a picnic at Hampton Court. We're thinking about 1960. And he would credit her in the foreword to Northamptonshire as performing like an overworked taxi chauffeur without limited working hours or free Sundays. But also in a later memoir as the source of some of the keenest observations of detail in the books, and the sort of importance of having a sidekick who had possibly little more time to look whilst he was kind of focused on checking the material that he'd come with, and would credit her for often perceiving things about places and buildings that he had not seen. After her death, other assistants, mostly students, took over, many of them from the Courtauld Institute. But this was very important, having this person to both drive, to arrange things, as it would have been impossible to cover the ground without that companion, and particularly to ensure that Pevsner could therefore stand up when he stated, "I have myself seen everything that I describe, with a few exceptions." And although there's not time to go into it here, I can only recommend that you read Susie Harris's biography of Pevsner, which published in 2011, to capture some of the experiences of those drivers undertaking this work with a man in a hurry. It was a very punishing schedule, and he would write back to the office, "The journeys are just not human. To bed 11:30, too tired even to read the paper. Up this morning at 6 to scribble, scribble, scribble. If only one could be proud of the result." So many and various were the hotels and pubs that they stayed in by 1958, 12 volumes into the series, that Pevsner was able to write to Pevsner and Lola were able to write to the Observer to advise on the proper but economical furnishing of a hotel room. And this experience also explains the dedication in the North Riding volume, 1966, to those publicans and hoteliers of England who provided me with a table in my bedroom to scribble on. So everything was done very much then and there, not building up notes to come home and gradually turn into the text of the books. Because when he got home, the travelling over, that was the time to shut himself away to write the introductions to the book. Cornwall, back in 1951, was dealt with in just 15 pages. By the later books, these were developing into 20 to 50-page essays on the development of architecture in each county, and critically written by a scholar up to date with the latest international research. And that was another feature that set the Buildings of England books on a different level, really, from previous guidebooks. They were very terse and uncompromisingly serious in many ways. Places were arranged in A to Z order. Within them, the entries on significant buildings were organised under churches, public buildings, and for larger places, the perambulations, a more free-flowing summary of other buildings of interest in the streets of a town or a city. And this rather curious term has almost certainly survived a lot longer in the English lexicon because of Pevsner's adoption of it, I feel. And of course, those perambulations were, in some ways, the direct descendant of those treasure hunts that he'd pioneered in the Architectural Review. Of course, a lot of attention, as I say, just as with the jackets, was given by the typographers at Penguin to the layout of the books. And it always strikes me as amazing that a series that's been around as long as it has never felt the need to depart essentially from the layout that Hans Schmoller at Penguin created for us in the early 50s. And the current volumes still follow these main conventions of starting a paragraph in the margin to denote a new subject, that very characteristic use of small capitals within the text, and always the use of italic for architects' names. There were, of course, illustrations, but gathered together as a sort of sandwich filling in the middle of the book, and arranged in chronological order generally of subject matter. They were not very well printed. They were often rather kind of smudgy photos in the first place, and they were also often drawn from the available photos in the National Monuments Record. And in certain of the early books, it will explain why there are an inordinate number of photos for one building, because that's really all that there was in the boxes, and only a smattering of better photos from Country Life, which, of course, was with Tony Kirsting and people were pioneering much better photography. And then at the end, a glossary to guide the reader through the more technical terms. Now, obviously, the limitations, as well as the positives of any multi-volume work produced by a single author will be obvious. The strict selectivity of the earlier books was inspired by a concept of what might turn the progress of mainstream art history, and left little room of obvious understanding of such matters as the vernacular architecture of each county, or in particular the local building materials. Deficiencies that were remedied somewhat over time by contributions from experts on matters like timber framing, like Freddie Charles in Worcestershire, and contributors on building materials with special essays by Alec Clifton Taylor, a long-standing friend of Pevsner. But from 1960, as I say, the period of non-stopology, the challenges of seeing the job through in timely fashion were acute, and Pevsner was very conscious that things might be at risk given his other commitments, and collaboration seemed inevitable. The first of the collaborators was the remarkable and idiosyncratic Ian Nairn, a colleague at the Architectural Review, who had actually recommended his services for the Surrey volume in the early 50s, possibly wasn't taken up on it because he'd only just published a rather critical review of some of the early books. But by the time he came back to ask again in about 1958, Pevsner was more receptive. Then there was John Harris, I mentioned earlier, who progressed from researcher to co-author for Lincolnshire, David Lloyd in Hampshire, Sandra Wedgwood in Warwickshire, and Jennifer Sherwood in Oxfordshire. Handing over the reins completely for a county was very rare. David Veery in Gloucestershire was one, and of course John Newman in Kent, John having started as one of those drivers, and then graduating to co-authoring volumes, but in particular to writing the 2 volumes for his own county of Kent. And Pevsner regarded John as his successor should it prove impossible for him to complete the series. But each of those co-authors brought something of their own interests and knowledge, whether it was country houses and estates in John Harris's case, or townscape, which was David Lloyd's specialism as a planner, and so on. What Nairn brought was a sort of degree of probably rudery in a way that the series wouldn't have before, and which set that volume, Surrey, out on its own in a way. And so what could have been a rather formulaic series became, over time, more nuanced and often unexpected. There were, of course, wider changes that benefited the books. On the one hand, there were the compilation of the early lists of buildings of special interest prepared by government, and particularly as the systematic survey started after 1953 under the aegis of the Historic Buildings Council. Pevsner would benefit both from early access to those lists, but also in time as the books more and more were completed, they would feed back in to the survey still to be done. And Pevsner would join an influential subcommittee of the council in 1959 to question the listing of Victorian buildings, which was permissible under the legislation, but rarely acted upon up till that time, the presumption then still being firmly in favour of pre-1800. But of course, Pevsner's interest in the Victorian period went right back to the beginning of his career, with his interest in the links between Morris and Gropius, and was, of course, sharpened in the more threatening environment of the 1960s, which brought him into the arena as a very influential member and chair of the Victorian Society. And on the top left of the screen is a cartoon which I inherited from David Lloyd, who was a key member of the Society, by Tom Greaves, who did a number of these satirical cartoons showing an early Society outing on the SS Toulon, a joke on the architect of that name, pulling up at the quayside where Pevsner, in mortarboard and gown, selling volumes of the Buildings of England, with the slightly more sort of twinkly figure of John Betjeman alongside. So this sort of involvement in the kind of activist side was just one aspect of the general growth of interest in many aspects of architectural history, which partly had been fostered, I think, by the series, but also was now making so many more buildings eligible for inclusion in the guides as they appeared. And Pevsner's own interests and approach also evolved as the series developed, as the research became more thorough, and as he became more confident of his audience. So in this way, the B.A.V. developed a new role over the course of those first editions of becoming a tool for conservationists and planners, strengthened by the emphasis under the Labour government of '64 in promoting the use of conservation areas, and in a way capturing precisely those ensembles such as planned suburban districts, which the perambulations in the guides might have singled out for attention. And of course, they were alive to the interest of the predominantly industrial areas of the Midlands and the north of England, though those early books were often extremely weak on the importance of the country's industrial heritage, and that again in time would benefit from a greater understanding by a younger generation. Pevsner, of course, as a member of the Historic Buildings Committee, was also involved in the first proposals for listing of 20th century buildings of the period up to 1939. Again, a subject that certainly set the series apart from other guides in having any interest at all in what the contemporary or near-contemporary scene was about. And indeed did produce an initial list of 50 suggested buildings meriting protection from the period between the end of the First War and the Second, though it would take many years before those were actually eligible or added to the list. But of course, again, it was very much informed by what he believed to be the important and appropriate style for the 20th century. So he could admire things like the Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill from pre-war period. He could admire the style of the Royal Festival Hall top left, but it would not have embraced the kind of American-inspired, jazzy Art Deco cinemas of the 20s, and you'll probably be quite familiar with his dismissal of the now much-loved Hoover factory in the west of London as one of the worst of the modernistic atrocities along the Great Western Road. And of course, he was out of sympathy with the continuation of the classical tradition. I think that can be overstated, but certainly I think he was somewhat bewildered by the way that had remained a strong strain in English architecture. And by the last volumes of the late 60s, he was certainly recognizing his own preferred tradition of international modernism was on the wane. And he found the history faculty building at Cambridge by James Stirling, 1963-8, actively ugly, rude, and anti-architecture. This was a building which declared very clearly a new approach amongst modernist architects, which emphasized the personal expression of the architect, regardless of context, and Pevsner did not feel in sympathy with its aggressive character, or indeed of many other buildings of that period that he regarded as a sort of return to expressionism. But this ability to say things like that in the books is important. The books they still contain opinions and value judgments. You don't have to agree with them, but they add spice to the necessary straight passages of description and made many entries memorable. And indeed, so distinctive was Pevsner's style and syntax, it was picked up by writers like Colin MacInnes. And it must be said that those slighting remarks, some people seem to revel in the bad marks given to them by Pevsner. And I've noticed over the years that a lot of church guides reprint the sort of abuse that they were given, almost as they'd rather that than high praise. You want to be either really loathed or really loved, I think. So, 74, there he is walking away from his last church in Staffordshire. There he is promoting the great towers of volumes that he had completed. And what he said when he finished his work, the first editions are ballon d'essai, the second editions are the ones that count. And indeed, he did believe very passionately in what he was trying to achieve, but he was very aware of the limitations and from the very beginning, hence the invitation to readers to contribute corrections and accept that further research would be needed in time and indeed would very likely require entries to be completely rewritten. So that work of revision was already underway even before his own first editions were complete. Those revisions were necessarily quite superficial. They were really restricted to putting in information that had either been sent in the way of corrections, or, as you'll note if you're familiar with the books, whatever the county architect could produce a list of, if they were canny enough, they could then guarantee mention of their schools, old people's homes, so on, in the revised edition. But the prospect of actually revisiting was not on the cards. But as the 70s progressed, more was possible, led by a new generation of editors at Penguin, themselves graduates in architectural history, and with the continuing presence of John Newman as the advisory editor eventually for the series. But so Bridget Cherry and Elizabeth Williamson were both responsible for the sort of first series of more thorough revisions and would continue on through the next generation, which by the time Pevsner had completed his work, he was 73, but in fact plans were already in hand by then for those surveys to be extended now out to Wales, Scotland and Ireland. And then a major change from the early 1980s was to switch to a much larger format of book, which is the one we still have with us now, which allowed for much more extensive expansion, much more room for new fields of research and interest, to which I referred a moment ago. And that great programme really got off the ground for the English series with the revised volume for London, South London, revised by Bridget, and published just before Pevsner's death. And then in the counties for Leicestershire and Rutland by Elizabeth Williamson. And meanwhile, exporting the idea via Damie Stillman to the United States, a series which still continues, funded by the Society of Architectural Historians, to a very different format than the English books, but on the same basic principle. But there were lots of upheavals in the publishing industry in the 80s, and that presented big new challenges to the continuation of the series. Costs of research and writing, which, no one had ever made money from being involved with the series, least of all Pevsner, and he had gone around anyone he could find to help support his researchers. But that was, of course, increasingly unpopular with Penguin by the end of the 80s. And so charitable trusts had to be set up in the early 90s for both Scotland and for the English and Welsh series, and latterly for Ireland, to pay for the very necessary costs of travel, things like illustrations and so on. And also just to ensure that there continued to be 2 full-time in-house editors who doubled as authors, initially Bridget and Elizabeth, and then joined from 94 by my colleague Simon Bradley, then embarking on the revision of the City of London and Westminster volumes, and I joined in 1997 to work on East London. So they, of course, were the London books meant we could usefully recover all of that ground as in-house projects, and by now reflecting London as it had become after the creation of Greater London in the mid-60s. But the objectives, both for these books and for the county volumes, where we would increasingly engage other authors as their availability and funds allowed, the objectives are still the same: to provide, as far as possible, short, clear and reliable surveys of each county's building, up to date with the latest research, and importantly, interested in the contemporary scene. Much of Pevsner could be retained, certainly in the county volumes, but by the 1990s, changes in many places since his day left little to work with. That's something that was thrown into stark relief when the focus turned to the London Docklands, then in a period of intense renewal. But that was an important stage because it allowed a diversification of format to be explored. It was the first paperback in the series since the 50s. Written by Elizabeth Williamson. And it was a good opportunity both to exploit the availability of funding from the Development Corporation that controlled Docklands, but also to foreground an area of intense significance in London, but undergoing some of the fastest rates of new development. And at that time, a very significantly architecturally led redevelopment, producing some very memorable things like John Outram's pumping station in the form of a temple with a kind of aircraft turbine in the pediment. These were areas that were well over 40 years since Pevsner had described them. I have to say, looking at the jacket of that volume against what is there now, it all seems rather quaint. So we continued to be published by Penguin, moving around a variety of offices and ending in the rather splendid premises in one little corner of Shelmeck's house overlooking the river on the Strand. Made our 50th anniversary there. Bridget then retired, and the series was taken over by Yale University Press, who were based where Pevsner had begun in Bloomsbury, in Bedford Square, just around the corner from the Pevsner's old office in Gower Street. And with us, along with Pevsner's table, travelled large numbers of box files full of readers' letters, articles, cuttings, and other ephemera that had been gathered ever since the previous edition had been published, all waiting to be deployed on one of the revisions. And I had to notice that as our output went up and the numbers of files decreased, our employer always found it easiest to move us into smaller and smaller rooms in the building. But as a major publisher of art history, Yale gave an enormous national and international boost to the profile of the books at that time, along with a general smartening up of their presentation through the rejacketing of all of the rather multivaried small format volumes that then existed in the English series, and in particular a move straight away to good colour photography for the insets, banishing the old black and white. And we were very lucky for a long time to be supported in the new photography by English Heritage, and their photographers' artistry really made the books stand out. And I always thought it was important that Sir Howard Colvin, distinguished architectural historian, would always say that when he saw a new volume, the first thing he did was go and look at the photos to see what the Pevsners deemed to be the most important 100 or so buildings to sum up a county. But of course, that move into colour also completely transformed one's understanding of what the character of a county was in the colour of its building stones, and in every way was a huge step forward for the series. And that renewed sense of purpose also was consolidated by the innovation of the city guides, developed as part of a Heritage Lottery Fund project, which began with Manchester, written by Claire Hartwell, and was followed by books on majority of the principal English cities, and designed to address a new audience, designed to be able to integrate colour photography with the text, and supporting information, but to still stick very closely to Pevsner's ideal of the books as an educational tool for a wide public. And they proved very successful, and they proved wholeheartedly that gritty is better than pretty, in that Sheffield sold out incredibly fast. And it just proved that the lack of good information about the buildings of the great cities meant there was a huge appetite for that. Had we just concentrated on the prettiest places in England, I'm not sure they would have worked as well. And a bit later, a series, we followed those books with a couple of introductions to specific building types, on which by that point we felt we'd covered enough ground to have something to say. Keeping up basically 4 books a year at the max helped to maintain the reputation and recognition of the series in the wider culture. It was gratifyingly acknowledged from time to time by seminars and conferences devoted to Pevsner and his series, some awards, but also, in a way, I always felt more importantly to the number of times that references to Pevsner popped up in fiction, or more importantly in cartoons in magazines. And this boastful mollusk, I think, proving that by now 2 decades or so after Pevsner's death, it was the books that he had created as much as the man which had really entered the public conscience. And I kept a file of all these little bits and pieces as we found them. But the difference, of course, in the new era was that, all the books had always taken time, but Pevsner had had a holiday to do it. We were now taking more like 3 years, if we were really working full-time, of about a year for research and 2 years for visiting and writing. But the methodology remained, despite the impact of important things like the internet and capacity for electronic research, I think would have remained remarkably recognisable to Pevsner when it was a process of visiting, a lot of cold calling at houses, writing up at the end of the day as much as possible, and once all of that was complete, finally the introduction. The books were, of course, had become much longer, they were much more detailed, they were much more informed in precisely the way that the early efforts had been criticised for being rather thin, and now making more time for research in archives and so on, rather than just secondary material. And to the extent that the later volumes contain many more genuine discoveries and new information. And the mission was still the same, to see everything described, producing at the end a huge amount of paper in the paper era to join Pevsner's notes in the Historic England archive. The lion's share of the full revisions happened since 2000. That put a huge amount of pressure on a very small team of essentially 2 editors, a production editor and a picture researcher at the publisher. And us trying to keep up with our own revisions while editing the contributions of the growing band of authors that we were engaging, not just in England, but in Wales and in Scotland, as their series were completed within the period in which we were trying to bring the English books up to date. And critical, of course, to keeping the show on the road, like anything, is finance. It's a private enterprise in the best sense, unacademic, so there are no footnotes or any other features of academic publishing in the Pevsners. And many of the revising authors were working for modest, if any, reward, largely really driven by a commitment to the series and its purpose. Yale provided the production support, and the Buildings Books Trust, as it then was, underwrote the research. But the transformative moment was when, in about 2011, the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, which shared Bedford Square with us, put a huge subvention behind the programme. And for the first time, that really, since Pevsner's day, gave this sort of total certainty that we could actually reach the objective and plan for the revision of all the remaining volumes with multiple authors engaged, and remove the problem that had always dogged it, which was how do you raise the money to support the research for some counties that you're unlikely to find it locally. I put up Bedfordshire, that was one of mine, and I have to say I have the distinction of having revised and updated the worst selling volume in the entire series, and it's still the worst selling volume. And of course we advanced with others in keeping up a presence on social media and developing websites, and finally we came full circle. I said that we finished 2 with Staffordshire, which was launched earlier this year. And that one was a moment of real mixed emotion, because it was caused immense pride to us after, 25 years for me, to have seen this complete, but also in the achievement of the really large family of authors over several decades, going back to involvement from the 1960s, some of whom enjoyed it so much they signed on for more than one project after another. But of course, tinged with the sadness that for now, with the disbanding of the editorial team, after that long period, unbroken period of 75 years, the prospect of new editions, at any rate for England and Wales and Scotland, has vanished. This was not to be the fourth bridge exercise that many hoped for. But much more positively, the project to cover the buildings of Ireland continues with 3 volumes in progress, and we hope will be complete before too long. And of course, meanwhile, exploration is made of the possibilities for a full digitization of the gazetteer of the books, so that the content can be assembled in the way that users want, updated, hopefully, and we can continue to fulfill Pevsner's aim of providing a portable guide to all buildings of significance from the far past to the present day. So you can see it became a 2-man job to hold up the towers of books when we finally had them all there. And the important thing is that people can continue to ask, what does Pevsner say? And these are the badges we produce to celebrate our completion. Finally, for many years, I kept a cutting above my desk from an editorial in The Guardian in 2007. I don't know its author, but it read, "As the British landscape has evolved, so have Pevsner's guides. To read a Pevsner guide is to discover familiar places in a newly informed light, human history in all its beauty and confusion." And there is, of course, much beauty and confusion in this world. And so I close with a card, Christmas card, drawn by Julian Orbach, author and co-author of several volumes in the Welsh and English series, which arrived in our office every year. And with that, I wish you a Merry Christmas and thank you.